London, May 1816. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Caldwell House in Bedford Square, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. In the drawing room, Penelope Sophronia Caldwell sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the weight of despair that pressed upon her shoulders like iron chains. At 22, she had learned to school her features into perfect stillness, to show nothing of the turmoil within. 6 months had passed since her father's death. 6 months since the creditors had begun their relentless march to the door. 6 months since she had discovered that the Marquis had gambled away not merely his fortune, but his family's entire future. Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "The Duke of Winchester has made his offer, Penelope. You will accept." If stories of love born from impossible circumstances touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Penelope looked at her mother, Lady Beatrice Caldwell, and saw not grief for a lost husband, but calculation in those pale blue eyes. The widow's weeds of black silk only emphasized the sharpness of her features, the determination in the set of her jaw. "The Beast of Winchester," Penelope said softly, testing the name on her tongue like bitter medicine. "The man who hides his face from all of London society. The man they say is cursed, deformed beyond recognition." "The man who has offered £15,000, her mother replied, her voice sharp as cut glass. "He has already procured a special license from the Archbishop, allowing you to marry without the reading of the banns. It is a fortune, Penelope, enough to settle every debt, enough to save your brothers from debtor's prison, enough to restore our good name. You will marry him. You have no choice." And truly she did not. Penelope thought of her younger brothers, George and Thomas, barely 16 and 14 respectively, their futures hanging in the balance. She thought of the bailiffs who had already begun cataloguing the contents of Caldwell House, marking each painting, each piece of furniture, each remnant of their former life for auction. She thought of the whispers that followed her mother through the streets of Mayfair, the way former friends now crossed to the other side when they saw Lady Caldwell approaching. "When?" Penelope asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. 3 days hence, St. George's Church in Hanover Square. A private ceremony, given the haste required by the special license. 3 days. 72 hours until she became the Duchess of Winchester, wife to a man no one had seen clearly in over a decade. The rumors about the Duke were legion and varied. Some said he had been burned in a fire, his face melted like candle wax. Others whispered of a terrible disease that had ravaged his features, leaving him too grotesque to bear the light of day. Still others claimed he was cursed by a witch, transformed into something neither fully human nor beast. What they all agreed upon was this: the Duke of Winchester wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face at all times, even indoors. He spoke little, moved through society like a shadow, and had refused every match proposed to him for the past 10 years. Until now. Until a desperate widow with a beautiful daughter and catastrophic debts had written to him, offering the one thing he apparently desired, a wife who had no choice but to accept him, regardless of what lay beneath that concealing hat. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. There was no trousseau to assemble, no joy in the anticipation. Penelope's younger sister, Margaret, just 17, wept openly at the thought of her elder sister marrying a monster. But Margaret did not understand the mathematics of desperation, the cold calculation that governed their lives now. On the morning of her wedding, Penelope stood before the mirror in her chamber and barely recognized the woman who stared back. The wedding dress was simple, far simpler than what a daughter of a marquess should have worn, but it was all they could afford. Ivory silk with minimal ornamentation, high-waisted in the current fashion, with long sleeves that covered her arms completely. Her dark blonde hair had been arranged in an elegant style, with small white roses tucked among the curls. She looked like a virgin sacrifice, she thought, and perhaps that was precisely what she was. The carriage ride to St. George's Church was mercifully brief. Her mother sat across from her, silent for once, her lips pressed into a thin line of satisfaction. They had done it. They had secured their family's salvation, regardless of the cost to Penelope's happiness or future. The church was nearly empty when they arrived. A few witnesses, the required minimum, sat in the pews. And at the altar, standing with his back to the door, was the Duke of Winchester. Even from behind, he was an imposing figure. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored black coat. His posture was rigid, controlled, as though every muscle in his body was held under tight restraint. And upon his head, just as the rumors promised, was a wide-brimmed black hat that cast his face in complete shadow. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked down the aisle on her mother's arm. Each step brought her closer to her fate, closer to the man who would own her, body and soul, from this moment forward. She tried to catch a glimpse of his face as she approached, but the brim of the hat was pulled so low that she could see nothing, not even the color of his eyes. When she reached the altar, the elderly vicar cleared his throat, looking nervously from the bride to the groom. "My lord," the vicar whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "it is customary to uncover one's head in the house of God." The Duke did not move. "Proceed," he said, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the quiet church. "The hat remains." The vicar paled, clearly scandalized by this breach of etiquette and reverence, but the Duke's bearing was so formidable that the holy man dared not argue further. He opened his book with shaking hands. Penelope stood alone beside her future husband, and for the first time, she heard his voice directed at her. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his tone low and carefully modulated, betraying no emotion whatsoever. "Your Grace," she replied, her own voice steadier than she had expected. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical efficiency. The vicar rushed through the vows with unseemly haste, eager to be done with this irregularity. Penelope repeated the words that would bind her to this stranger, these promises to love, honor, and obey a man whose face she had never seen, whose voice she had heard for less than a minute. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke did not lift his hat. He did not kiss his bride. He simply turned and offered her his arm, and together they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, the Duke and Duchess of Winchester. The wedding breakfast was a miserable affair held at Caldwell House. The Duke sat at the head of the table, his hat still firmly in place, a silent affront to proper dining etiquette that made the very air in the room feel heavy. He ate nothing. He spoke only when directly addressed, his responses brief and courteous but utterly devoid of warmth. Penelope's brothers stared at him with barely concealed fear. Her sister Margaret could not look at him at all. When the interminable meal finally concluded, the Duke rose from his seat. "The carriage is waiting, Your Grace," he said to Penelope, using her new title for the first time. "We depart for Winchester House immediately." Penelope had barely time to embrace her siblings before she was ushered into the Duke's magnificent carriage. The interior was luxurious beyond anything she had known even in her family's prosperous days, but the luxury felt like a gilded cage. The Duke sat across from her, silent and still as a statue. Penelope could feel his eyes upon her, though she could not see them beneath the shadow of that damned hat. The tension in the small space was suffocating. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Penelope spoke. "Your Grace, I want to thank you for your generosity to my family. The settlement you provided has saved us from complete ruin." "It was a business arrangement, nothing more," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "You need not thank me for paying the agreed-upon price." The words stung, though Penelope supposed they were honest. She was a commodity, purchased to fulfill some purpose she did not yet understand. Gratitude seemed absurd in such a transaction. Winchester House stood on Park Lane overlooking Hyde Park, a magnificent Georgian mansion of pale stone with soaring columns and more windows than Penelope could count. Servants lined the entrance as the carriage arrived. A full household staff assembled to meet their new mistress. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman of perhaps 50 years, stepped forward as Penelope descended from the carriage. "Mrs. Blackwell, Your Grace," she said with a deep curtsy, "we are honored to welcome the new Duchess of Winchester." Penelope smiled at the assembled staff, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. She noticed that the staff did not look at the Duke with fear. but rather with a fierce protective loyalty. They kept their eyes averted, not out of terror, but out of respect for his privacy. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell. I look forward to learning from you all." The Duke strode past them without a word, disappearing into the house like a shadow. Mrs. Blackwell's expression softened slightly as she looked at Penelope. "His Grace has requested that you join him in the library at 8 o'clock this evening, Your Grace. Until then, I will show you to your chambers and acquaint you with the household." The hours until 8 o'clock passed in a haze of information. Winchester House was enormous, with dozens of rooms spread across 4 floors. Penelope learned that the staff was paid handsomely for their discretion, and their devotion to the Duke was absolute. They would never betray his secrets to the gossips of London. As 8 o'clock approached, Penelope changed into one of the new gowns, a simple dinner dress of deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes. She arranged her hair carefully, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. This would be her wedding night, she realized. Whatever lay ahead, whatever the Duke wanted from her, it would begin in that library. A footman escorted her through the labyrinthine corridors of Winchester House until they reached a set of double doors carved with intricate designs. He knocked once, then opened the door. "The Duchess of Winchester, Your Grace," he announced, then withdrew, closing the door behind Penelope with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. The library was magnificent, 2 stories high with shelves that reached to the ceiling, accessible by a graceful spiral staircase. Firelight danced across thousands of leather-bound volumes, creating an atmosphere that would have been cozy if not for the tension that vibrated in the air. The Duke stood by the fireplace. He was not posing, he seemed to have been caught off guard. His hand was raised to the brim of his hat, adjusting it hurriedly as if he had only just placed it upon his head to ensure he was covered before she entered. "Close the door, if you please," he said quietly. Penelope obeyed, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the key in the lock. When she faced him again, the Duke had moved closer, though he maintained a respectful distance between them. "What I am about to show you," he said, his voice tight with something that might have been pain or anger or both, "I have shown to no one in over 10 years. I require your word that you will not scream, will not faint, and will not flee this room. Can you give me that word, Your Grace?" Penelope's mouth went dry. Whatever deformity he concealed, it must be truly terrible if he required such promises. But she lifted her chin and met the shadow where his eyes should be. "You have my word, Your Grace. I will not scream, faint, or flee." He studied her for a moment longer as though assessing the truth of her promise. Then, with movements that seemed weighted with resignation, he reached up and removed his hat. Penelope's breath caught in her throat, but not with horror, with shock of an entirely different kind. The Duke of Winchester was beautiful. Not handsome, not merely attractive, but devastatingly, impossibly, almost painfully beautiful. His hair was thick and dark as midnight, falling in waves that framed a face that might have been carved by a master sculptor. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that was both sensual and austere. But it was his eyes that held her transfixed, deep brown eyes that burned with intelligence and pain, and something very much like defiance. There was no deformity, no scarring, no disease, no curse. Nothing but masculine beauty, so pronounced it seemed almost unreal. "You are not," Penelope began, her voice failing her. "You are not what they say. You are not disfigured at all. You are beautiful." The Duke's expression twisted into something bitter and aching. "And there, Your Grace, is precisely the problem. That is exactly what everyone sees, and it is the very reason I hide." He turned away from her, setting the hat on a nearby table with careful precision. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "I have been called beautiful my entire life. From the moment I was born, my mother was consumed by vanity regarding my appearance. She paraded me like a prized peacock. 'Isn't he beautiful?' she would say to anyone who would listen. 'Look at my beautiful boy.' As though my face was my only value, my only worth." Penelope remained silent, sensing that he needed to speak, that these were words long trapped inside him. "As I grew older, it only worsened," he continued, pacing now like a caged animal. "Women pursued me not for who I was, but for what I looked like. They wanted to possess me, to display me as one might display a piece of fine art. They saw nothing of my mind, my interests, my soul. I was merely a beautiful object to be acquired. He stopped pacing and faced her directly, and Penelope saw raw pain in those remarkable eyes. When I was 23, I became engaged to Lady Isabella Aldridge. I thought she was different. For months we courted, and I believed she saw beyond my face to the man beneath. I was fool enough to think I had found love. The bitterness in his voice made Penelope's heart ache. She could see where this story was leading, could feel the betrayal that was coming. 3 hours before our wedding, the Duke said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. I arrived early at the church. I heard voices in one of the anterooms, Isabella and her sister Juliana, discussing the upcoming ceremony. And I heard Isabella say as clearly as I hear my own voice now, "Love? Who cares about love when you wake to a face like a fallen angel? I shall have the most beautiful husband in all of England, and that is worth far more than any tender sentiment." Penelope gasped, unable to contain her shock at such casual cruelty. "I cancelled the wedding immediately," the Duke continued, his voice now flat and emotionless. "The scandal was enormous. The Aldridge family threatened to sue for breach of promise. I paid them a generous settlement to avoid the courts, and they accepted with unseemly haste. It confirmed what I had suspected. They had wanted my wealth and title as much as Isabella had wanted my face." He moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as though they held answers to questions he had not asked. After that, I began to spread my own rumors. I paid servants to whisper that I had been disfigured, cursed, transformed into something monstrous. I started wearing the hat, hiding my face from all of London, and I discovered something liberating in that concealment. "People feared you instead of desiring you," Penelope said softly, understanding dawning. "Precisely," the Duke confirmed. "Fear is clean, honest in its way. Fear does not pretend affection while harboring only greed. Fear does not promise love while seeing only a beautiful object. I preferred to be called the Beast of Winchester than to endure one more woman looking at me the way Isabella did, as though I were a particularly fine horse she had won at auction." Penelope moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice, by the lonely isolation of a man who had hidden himself for a decade to escape being valued only for his surface. "And yet you chose to marry. Why now? Why me?" The Duke turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something like vulnerability in his expression. "Because you had no choice, Your Grace. Because your acceptance of my proposal was born of necessity, not desire. Because I knew you would marry the Beast of Winchester to save your family, and in that transaction at least, there would be honesty. You would not pretend to love me for my face when we both know you married me for my fortune." The words should have been insulting, but Penelope heard only truth in them, and a strange kind of relief. He was right. Their marriage was a business arrangement, free from the pretense and deception that had wounded him so deeply. In that, at least, they stood on honest ground. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I give you my word, Your Grace, that I will never reduce you to merely your appearance. You have shown me great kindness in saving my family from ruin. I would repay that kindness by seeing you as you wish to be seen, as a man of substance rather than merely a beautiful face." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a softening around his eyes that suggested her words had reached him. "Thank you, Your Grace. That is all I ask." They stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly between them, and Penelope felt the first fragile thread of understanding begin to weave itself between them. This would not be the marriage she had once dreamed of as a girl, full of romance and passionate declarations, but perhaps it could be something better, a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. "I have a request to make of you," the Duke said, his tone formal once more. "The Tun will expect us to appear together during the remainder of the season. I will wear my hat in public as always, but here in our home, I would prefer not to hide. Can you accept that? Can you look upon this face without allowing it to color your judgment of me?" "I can," Penelope replied with quiet conviction, "and I will." "Then we have an understanding, Your Grace." He retrieved his hat from the table, Holding it in his hands like a shield he was reluctant to raise once more. "Your chambers are connected to mine by the door you no doubt observed. I will not enter your room without your express permission. Our marriage is valid and binding, but I have no wish to force my attentions upon you. If and when you desire a more complete union, you need only inform me." The words were stiff, formal, but Penelope heard the respect behind them. He was offering her liberty in a situation where she had very little. It was more consideration than many husbands showed their wives. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I appreciate your courtesy." "Nathaniel," he said suddenly, the name falling from his lips like a confession. "When we are alone, you may call me Nathaniel. I find I am weary of formality in my own home." "Nathaniel," Penelope repeated, tasting the name. "Then you must call me Penelope." "Penelope," he said, and something in the way he pronounced her name with careful attention to each syllable made her shiver. That night, Penelope lay alone in her vast bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the extraordinary day she had endured. She had married the Beast of Winchester and discovered him to be a man of remarkable beauty, hiding from a world that had reduced him to that beauty alone. She had entered into a marriage of convenience and found instead the possibility of something more complex, more honest, more real than any romantic fantasy. Through the connecting door she could hear the faint sounds of movement in the Duke's chambers. Nathaniel's chambers, she corrected herself. Her husband, who was not a monster, but a man wounded by the very thing most people would consider a blessing. Sleep came slowly, and with it dreams of dark eyes that burned with intelligence and pain, and a voice that spoke her name as though it mattered. The days that followed established a pattern that was both strange and oddly comfortable. Nathaniel spent his mornings attending to business affairs in his study, managing the extensive Winchester estates and investments with a keen mind that Penelope was only beginning to appreciate. She, in turn, worked with Mrs. Blackwell to learn the intricacies of managing Winchester House, a task that proved far more complex than she had anticipated. They dined together each evening in the small dining room, rather than the formal dining hall, an intimacy that Nathaniel had suggested and Penelope had gratefully accepted. At first, their conversations were stilted, careful, two strangers navigating unfamiliar territory. But gradually, as the days turned into a week and then two, they began to talk more freely. It was during a quiet afternoon tea in the garden that the final barrier of formality truly began to crack. Mrs. Blackwell had served a tray of summer pastries, including small glazed strawberry tarts. Penelope watched as Nathaniel reached for one. He took a bite, and for a moment his eyes closed in pure, unguarded pleasure. A small dollop of bright red jam escaped the pastry, landing on the corner of his perfect mouth. He froze, his eyes flying open, looking suddenly mortified, as if he expected to be mocked for his lack of dignity. Penelope did not mock him. She smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. "It seems even the Duke of Winchester has a weakness for sweets." Nathaniel relaxed, a sheepish grin transforming his face into something boyish and devastatingly charming. He wiped the jam away with his napkin. "A weakness indeed," he admitted, his voice light. "I confess I have always had a fondness for strawberries. My nurse used to sneak them to me when my mother wasn't looking." "Then you shall have them," Penelope declared. "I will instruct the cook to ensure they are always available." It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone watching from the outside, but for them it was a turning point. It was the moment the myth of the beast truly died, replaced by a man who liked strawberry tarts and could laugh at himself. Penelope discovered that Nathaniel possessed a sharp wit and a deep knowledge of literature, history, and philosophy. He had spent his years of self-imposed isolation reading voraciously, educating himself far beyond what his tutors at Cambridge had provided. When he spoke of books, his face came alive in a way that had nothing to do with physical beauty and everything to do with genuine passion. In turn, Nathaniel seemed fascinated by Penelope's observations about the world, her quiet intelligence, her wry humor. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, his expression thoughtful and unguarded. It was during one of their dinners, nearly 3 weeks into their marriage, that Nathaniel made an unexpected suggestion. "The Dowager Duchess of Somerton is hosting a ball next week," he said, carefully cutting his roasted pheasant. "She has sent an invitation requesting our attendance. I know you have been isolated here at Winchester House since our marriage. If you wish to attend, to see something of society, I will escort you." Penelope set down her fork, surprised. "You would attend, but you have avoided such events for years." "I have avoided them," Nathaniel agreed, "but you should not be punished for my preferences. You are the Duchess of Winchester now. You deserve to take your place in society, to have friends and connections beyond these walls. I will wear my hat, as always, and endure the whispers for your sake." The offer touched Penelope more than she cared to admit. She had indeed felt the isolation of Winchester House, the lack of female companionship beyond Mrs. Blackwell. The thought of attending a ball, of wearing one of the beautiful gowns Nathaniel had provided, of dancing and conversing with others, held considerable appeal. "I would like that," she said softly. "Thank you, Nathaniel." He smiled, a rare and genuine expression that transformed his already handsome face into something luminous. "Then it is settled. We shall attend the Somerton ball." The week passed quickly, filled with preparations. Nathaniel insisted on accompanying Penelope to Bond Street to select jewelry appropriate for the ball, an expedition that proved both amusing and revealing. He wore his hat pulled low, as always in public, but his knowledge of gemstones and fashion was extensive. "The sapphires," he said definitively when Penelope hesitated between two sets. "They complement your eyes and will suit the blue silk gown I selected for the occasion." "You selected my ball gown?" Penelope asked, surprised. Nathaniel had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I may have worked with the modiste to ensure your wardrobe was complete. Fashion, you see, was one of the few interests my mother approved of. She believed a beautiful person should always be beautifully dressed. I learned more than I ever wished to know about fabrics and styles." Penelope laughed, delighted by this unexpected glimpse into his past. "Then I shall trust your judgment entirely. The sapphires it is." The night of the Somerton ball arrived with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Penelope's lady's maid, a skilled young woman named Grace, had arranged her hair in an elegant style with small sapphire pins scattered among the dark blonde curls. The blue silk gown fit perfectly, its low neckline and high waist in the height of fashion, and the sapphire necklace glittered at her throat like captured starlight. When she descended the stairs to meet Nathaniel in the entrance hall, she found him waiting in immaculate evening attire. His black coat fitted perfectly to his broad shoulders, his cravat tied in an intricate style that spoke of careful attention. The wide-brimmed hat cast his face in its customary shadow, but Penelope could feel his eyes upon her as she approached. "You are exquisite," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion she could not quite name. "Thank you," Penelope replied, feeling warmth spread across her cheeks. "You are quite elegant yourself." The journey to Somerton House was brief, but Penelope could feel tension radiating from Nathaniel. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. This was difficult for him, she realized. This return to society that had judged him first as an object of desire, and then, when he refused to play that role, as a monster to be feared. "We need not stay long," she said gently. "An hour, perhaps, just to make an appearance." Nathaniel's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you. Yes, an hour should suffice." Somerton House blazed with light, music spilling from its windows into the warm May night. Carriages lined the street, depositing elaborately dressed members of the ton who climbed the steps in clusters, already gossiping and laughing. Penelope felt Nathaniel's arm tense beneath her hand as they approached the entrance. The butler announced them in ringing tones, "His Grace the Duke of Winchester and Her Grace the Duchess of Winchester." The ballroom fell silent. Every head turned toward them, every eye fixed on the tall figure in the concealing hat and the beautiful woman on his arm. Penelope felt the weight of their stares, heard the immediate whispers that erupted like wildfire. "The beast has emerged from his lair. Can you believe he brought her, that poor girl? I heard he never removes that hat even at home. Imagine the horror of it." Penelope's spine stiffened, her chin lifting in automatic defiance. These people knew nothing of the man beside her, nothing of his intelligence or his kindness or his pain. They saw only the story they had created, the monster they needed him to be. The Dowager Duchess of Somerton, a formidable woman in her 60s with keen blue eyes and iron-grey hair, swept toward them with the authority of a battleship in full sail. "Winchester," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "How delightful that you have finally graced us with your presence. And this must be your lovely bride. My dear Duchess, welcome. I am so pleased you could attend." The Dowager's warmth was genuine, her smile kind, and Penelope felt a rush of gratitude toward this woman, who treated them with simple courtesy rather than morbid curiosity. "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace," Penelope replied. "Your home is magnificent. Come, let me introduce you to some of the other ladies," the Dowager said, tucking Penelope's free arm through her own. "Winchester, you may retrieve your wife later. I am commandeering her for the moment." Nathaniel bowed slightly, and Penelope caught a glimpse of relief in the shadows beneath his hat. He would be more comfortable without her by his side, she realized, free to retreat to the edges of the ballroom where he could observe without being observed. The Dowager introduced Penelope to a whirlwind of titled ladies, most of whom were kind if somewhat curious about the mysterious Duke's new wife. But as they moved through the ballroom, Penelope became aware of a particular group of women watching her with expressions that were decidedly less friendly. "That, my dear, is Lady Isabella Barrett, formerly Aldridge," the Dowager murmured, following Penelope's gaze. "And her sister, Lady Juliana Aldridge. I would advise you to avoid them if possible. They are vipers, both of them." Penelope's heart quickened. Lady Isabella, the woman who had broken Nathaniel's heart, who had valued his face over his soul. She was beautiful, Penelope had to admit, with golden hair and pale skin, and a figure that her emerald green gown displayed to perfection. But there was something hard in her eyes, something calculating in the way she studied Penelope. "I see she has spotted you," the Dowager said with a sigh. "Brace yourself, my dear. Isabella has never forgiven Winchester for jilting her, though God knows it was the wisest decision he ever made." Before Penelope could respond, Lady Isabella glided toward them, her sister Juliana following in her wake like a pale shadow. Both women wore identical expressions of false sympathy that made Penelope's skin crawl. "Your Grace," Isabella said, her voice dripping with honey, "how brave of you to appear in society. I do hope you are settling into your new role as Winchester's wife. It must be such a trial, married to a man whose face you have never properly seen." The words were spoken loud enough for those nearby to hear, and Penelope saw several women lean closer, eager for scandal. "On the contrary, Lady Barrett," Penelope replied coolly, "I find my husband to be everything I could have hoped for. His appearance is the least interesting thing about him." Isabella's eyes narrowed slightly. "How charitable of you to say so, but surely you must be curious. The rumors are so varied. Some say he was burned, others that he suffers from a wasting disease. I confess, when I was briefly engaged to him, I did wonder what he might be hiding beneath that hat." "Then you are more foolish than I thought," the Dowager interrupted sharply, "to have let such a man slip through your fingers. Winchester is worth 10 of most men in this room, regardless of what he looks like." Isabella's smile became brittle. "Of course, Your Grace, I meant no offense. I simply find it curious that a man would so completely hide himself unless he had something to hide. One does wonder what terrible secret he conceals." Penelope felt anger rising in her chest, hot and protective. These women knew nothing of Nathaniel's suffering, nothing of the cruelty he had endured. They thought they were entitled to his face, to his beauty, as though it belonged to them rather than to him. "My husband conceals nothing from me," Penelope said firmly, "and what he chooses to reveal or conceal from others is entirely his own affair. Now, if you will excuse me, I believe I see him across the room." She swept away from Isabella and Juliana with the Dowager still on her arm, leaving the two women staring after her with matching expressions of displeasure. "Well done, my dear," the Dowager murmured approvingly. "Isabella needed to be put in her place. She has traded on her connection to Winchester for far too long." Penelope found Nathaniel standing near one of the tall windows, partially concealed by heavy velvet drapery. He looked tense, his posture rigid, and she realized with a pang that this must be torture for him, surrounded by the very people he had spent a decade avoiding. "Nathaniel," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Would you like to leave? We have made our appearance. There is no need to stay longer." He looked down at her, and though she could not see his eyes clearly, she felt the gratitude in his gaze. "I would be grateful, yes. This is more difficult than I anticipated." They made their farewells to the dowager, who kissed Penelope's cheek and whispered, "You are good for him, child. Do not let the vipers poison what you are building." The carriage ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Nathaniel removed his hat as soon as they were enclosed in privacy, and Penelope saw exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for defending me to Lady Barrett. I heard what she said, what you said in return." "She had no right," Penelope replied, feeling the anger surge again. "She had no right to speak of you that way, to question your choices, to act as though you owed her or anyone else an explanation." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the dim light of the carriage lamps. Then, with a gesture that seemed to cost him something, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm, strong, and Penelope felt her breath catch at the contact. "You see me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not my face, not the story people have created, but me. I did not expect that when I proposed this marriage. I did not dare to hope for it." Penelope turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "I am beginning to understand what it means to be seen truly, Nathaniel. You have given me the freedom to be more than my father's debt, more than a commodity sold to the highest bidder. Perhaps we can give each other that gift, the freedom to be ourselves without pretense or performance." Something shifted in that moment, some invisible barrier between them crumbling like ancient stone. When they arrived at Winchester House, Nathaniel did not release her hand as they climbed the stairs. At the door to her chambers he paused, and Penelope saw vulnerability and hope warring in his expression. "Would you?" he began, then stopped, seeming to gather courage. "Would you join me in the library? I find I'm not ready for this evening to end, and I thought perhaps we might share a glass of wine and continue our conversation." Penelope's heart fluttered in her chest. This was an invitation to something more than formality, something deeper than the careful courtesy that had governed their interactions thus far. "I would like that very much," she said. The library was warm and welcoming, the fire already lit by some attentive servant. Nathaniel poured them each a glass of rich red wine, and they settled into the comfortable chairs near the hearth. The firelight played across Nathaniel's features, highlighting the clean lines of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the intensity of his eyes. "Tell me about your life before," Penelope said. "Before the engagement to Lady Isabella, before you chose to hide. What were you like as a boy?" Nathaniel took a sip of wine, his expression thoughtful. "Lonely," he said finally. "I was an only child, you see. My father died when I was quite young, leaving me the title and all its responsibilities at the age of 15. My mother was fixated upon my appearance from my earliest memories. She would spend hours dressing me in the finest clothes, parading me before her friends, collecting their compliments like treasures." He paused, staring into the fire. "I learned to perform, to smile and bow, and accept their praise as though it were my due. But inside, I felt hollow. No one asked what I thought, what I dreamed, what I feared. They saw only the pretty picture I presented. That must have been terribly isolating," Penelope said softly. "It was," Nathaniel agreed. "When I went to Cambridge, I hoped things would be different. And for a time they were. I found friends who valued my mind, professors who challenged me intellectually. But even there, I could not escape it entirely. Women would find excuses to approach me, to touch my arm, to gaze at me with that particular look of possession in their eyes." He turned to face Penelope directly. "When I met Isabella, she seemed different. She spoke to me of books, of ideas, of the world beyond London society. I thought I had found someone who saw past the surface to the person beneath. To discover that she was perhaps the worst of all, that she actively did not care about who I was so long as I was beautiful, it broke something in me." Penelope set down her wineglass and moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "I am so sorry that happened to you. No one deserves to be reduced to a single attribute, to be valued only for something as arbitrary as physical appearance. You are so much more than your face, Nathaniel. You are brilliant, kind, thoughtful, generous. Those are the things that matter, the things that make you worthy of love and respect. Nathaniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Do you truly believe that, Penelope? Or are you simply being kind? I believe it with all my heart, she said fiercely. These past weeks I have come to know you as a person, not as the Beast of Winchester, or even as the beautiful Duke you were before. I know you as Nathaniel, a man who reads late into the night, who has a weakness for strawberry tarts, who treats his servants with uncommon kindness, who built a hospital for the poor on his estate in Devon. Those are the things that define you, not the accident of your features. A single tear escaped down Nathaniel's cheek, and without thinking, Penelope reached up to brush it away. The touch seemed to unlock something in both of them. Nathaniel's hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Penelope breathed. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid of breaking the fragile connection between them. But as Penelope's lips parted beneath his, as her hands came up to tangle in his dark hair, the kiss deepened into something more passionate, more real, more true than either of them had expected. When they finally drew apart, both breathing heavily, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words raw and honest. "I did not think I was capable of it anymore, but you have proven me wrong." Penelope's heart soared. "And I with you, Nathaniel. These weeks together have shown me what marriage can be when it is built on respect and understanding rather than mere obligation. I love you, not for your face or your title or your wealth, but for the man you are beneath all of that." They made love that night in Nathaniel's chambers, a joining that was both tender and passionate, a physical manifestation of the emotional connection they had forged. Afterwards, lying in Nathaniel's arms with her head pillowed on his chest, Penelope felt a sense of peace and completeness she had never known. "No more separate chambers," Nathaniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I want you here with me, always." "Always," Penelope agreed, snuggling closer, but as the silence of the night settled around them, a tremor of doubt seemed to pass through Nathaniel. He pulled back slightly, his dark eyes searching hers in the dim light. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice laced with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "You will not tire of my face. You will not come to resent my presence as others have." Penelope reached up, cupping his cheek firmly. "Never," she promised, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "You are my husband, Nathaniel, my partner. I could never tire of the man who sees me as I truly am." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, pulling her close again. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. The following weeks were the happiest of Penelope's life. She and Nathaniel were inseparable, spending their days together exploring London, riding in Hyde Park in the early mornings when few were about, attending the theatre and galleries. Nathaniel still wore his hat in public, but Penelope noticed that he seemed less burdened by it now, more at peace with his choice to conceal himself from a society that had proven unworthy of his trust. At home they talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their thoughts and dreams with the freedom of two people who had found in each other a safe harbor. Nathaniel began to teach Penelope Greek and Latin, delighting in her quick mind and genuine interest. Penelope introduced Nathaniel to her love of watercolor painting, and they spent sunny afternoons in the conservatory, painting side by side. They made love often, with a passion that seemed to grow rather than diminish with familiarity. Nathaniel was a generous and attentive lover, and Penelope discovered a sensuality in herself that she had never known existed. But their happiness was not destined to remain unchallenged. It began with whispers at a garden party, hosted by the Marchioness of Devonshire. Penelope was taking tea with several other ladies when she noticed them glancing at her with expressions of pity and barely concealed excitement. Finally, Lady Caroline Forsyth, a notorious gossip, could contain herself no longer. "My dear Duchess," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I feel I must warn you. There are rumors circulating about the Duke. Quite distressing rumors, I am afraid. Penelope set down her teacup with careful control. What sort of rumors, Lady Caroline? Well, it is said that he has been seen in the company of Lady Isabella Barrett, multiple times in fact, late at night, entering her townhouse on Charles Street. There is even talk of love letters exchanged between them, passionate declarations of an affair that has been ongoing for months. The words struck Penelope like physical blows, but she kept her expression neutral. I see. And who precisely is spreading these rumors? Lady Caroline had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I could not say for certain, Your Grace, but they are all over London. Everyone is talking about it. Penelope excused herself shortly thereafter, her mind racing. She did not believe for a moment that Nathaniel was having an affair with Isabella or anyone else. The man she had come to know over the past 2 months was incapable of such deception. But someone was deliberately spreading these lies, and she had a fairly good idea who that someone might be. When she arrived home, she found Nathaniel in his study, bent over correspondence. He looked up as she entered, and his smile faded immediately when he saw her expression. What has happened? He asked, rising from his desk. Penelope told him everything, watching anger darken his features as she recounted the rumors. When she finished, Nathaniel's jaw was tight with fury. The Aldridges, he said, his voice cold as winter. It must be them. Isabella and her wretched family seeking revenge for the humiliation of the broken engagement all those years ago. But why now? Penelope asked. What has changed? You, Nathaniel said simply. At the Somerton ball you defended me publicly. You made it clear that our marriage is real, that I am not the monster they need me to be. Isabella cannot tolerate that. She has built her identity around being the woman I jilted, the beautiful victim of the beast's cruelty. If I am happy, if I have found love with another woman, it diminishes her story. Penelope moved to stand beside him, taking his hand. What should we do? We ignore it, Nathaniel said firmly. Rumors are nothing but air. They cannot harm us if we do not give them power. But the rumors did not fade. They grew, becoming more elaborate and damaging with each passing day. Someone produced a letter, supposedly written by Nathaniel to Isabella, declaring his undying love and regret for their broken engagement. The letter was passed from hand to hand throughout the ton, copied carefully by hand and distributed with malicious glee. Nathaniel examined the letter when a copy was delivered to Winchester House by a so-called friend. His face went pale as he read the intimate phrases, the passionate declarations that he had never written. It is a forgery, he said, his voice shaking with rage. The handwriting is similar to mine, but not exact. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create this. Can we prove it is false? Penelope asked. Perhaps, Nathaniel said slowly. If we can compare it directly to my actual correspondence, the differences should be evident. But who will believe us? Half of London already thinks I am conducting an affair. They will assume I am simply denying the evidence. As if the forged letter were not enough, new rumors began to circulate. It was said that Nathaniel had been seen climbing through a window into Isabella's bedchamber, that he had given her expensive gifts, jewels and gowns far more costly than anything he had provided his own wife, that he had promised to divorce Penelope and make Isabella the Duchess of Winchester. The whispers followed Penelope everywhere. At the lending library, conversations would cease when she entered, only to resume in urgent whispers as soon as she passed. Invitations to social events slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Even the Dowager Duchess of Somerton, who had been so kind at her ball, sent a carefully worded note suggesting that perhaps Penelope might prefer to retire to the country until the scandal subsided. Through it all, Nathaniel remained steadfast. He held Penelope when she wept with frustration and anger. He assured her again and again that the rumors were lies, that he loved her, and only her, that Isabella meant nothing to him but a painful memory. I believe you, Penelope told him, and she did. But the constant assault of whispers and pitying glances was wearing on her spirit. The situation came to a head at a musicale hosted by Lady Hermione Talbot. Penelope had not wished to attend, but Nathaniel had insisted that they could not hide forever, that they must face society, and demonstrate that their marriage was strong. They arrived late, slipping into seats at the back of the music room as a young soprano began an aria from Mozart. Penelope could feel eyes upon them, could hear the rustle of whispers even over the music. Her hands trembled in her lap, and Nathaniel covered them with his own, offering silent support. During the interval, as guests mingled and took refreshments, Penelope found herself face to face with Lady Isabella Barrett and her sister Juliana. Both women wore expressions of false sympathy that made Penelope's blood boil. "Your Grace," Isabella said, her voice dripping with honey-sweet poison. "How brave of you to show your face in society, given the circumstances. I do admire your fortitude." "What circumstances would those be, Lady Barrett?" Penelope asked coolly. Isabella's eyes widened in feigned surprise. "Why, the affair, of course. Everyone knows about the Duke's late-night visits to my townhouse, about the passionate letters he has written, declaring his love for me. Surely you must be aware." "I am aware," Penelope said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest, "of malicious lies being spread by jealous, spiteful women who cannot accept that the Duke chose me over you, even when presented with your supposed charms." Isabella's mask of sympathy slipped, revealing the viper beneath. "Chose you? He was forced to marry you by your mother's desperation and your family's debts. Do you truly believe he loves you? That he finds anything in you to admire beyond your willingness to accept him despite his monstrous appearance?" The words were loud enough to carry across the room, and conversations stopped abruptly as people turned to watch the confrontation. Penelope felt humiliation burn through her, but before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That is quite enough, Lady Barrett." Nathaniel strode forward, and Penelope saw that he was carrying his hat in his hand rather than wearing it. His face was fully visible for the first time in a decade, and the effect on the assembled guests was immediate and dramatic. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by stunned silence. He was, as Penelope well knew, devastatingly beautiful. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, the intensity of his dark eyes, the sensual curve of his mouth. Women stared at him with expressions of shock and desire. Men looked at him with envy and confusion. But Nathaniel had eyes only for Isabella, and the look he gave her was one of utter contempt. "You have spread vicious lies about me and my wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "You have forged letters in my handwriting and invented stories of affairs that never occurred. And why? Because I refused to marry you 10 years ago, when I discovered that you valued my face over my character." Isabella's face had gone pale. "I have done no such thing. Those letters are genuine. Everyone has seen them." "Have they?" Nathaniel reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "These are actual letters, written by my hand, correspondence with my solicitor, with my steward, with various business associates. I suggest we compare them now, here, with the letter you have been circulating as proof of my supposed passion for you." He beckoned to Lord Ashton Fairfax, a noted collector of manuscripts and expert in handwriting analysis. "My lord, would you be so kind as to examine these documents?" Lord Fairfax moved forward eagerly, his scholarly instincts engaged. He studied the genuine letters, then the forged one that someone produced from a reticule. The room waited in breathless silence as he compared them, his expression growing more grave with each passing moment. "The forged letter is clever," Lord Fairfax finally pronounced, "but it is undoubtedly a forgery. The formation of certain letters is subtly different, and the pressure of the pen is inconsistent with the Duke's natural hand. Whoever created this is skilled, but not skilled enough to deceive a trained eye." Isabella's face went from pale to flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That proves nothing. Perhaps you are lying to protect him." "I have no reason to lie," Lord Fairfax said stiffly. "My reputation as a scholar depends upon my integrity. This letter is false, and I will state as much to anyone who asks." Nathaniel turned to address the room at large, his voice ringing with authority. "Let me be absolutely clear. I have never conducted an affair with Lady Barrett. I have never visited her townhouse. I have never written her love letters. Every rumor you have heard about me and Lady Barrett is a malicious fabrication designed to harm my wife and destroy my marriage." He moved to stand beside Penelope, taking her hand in his and raising it to his lips. "I love my wife. She is the only woman I have ever truly loved, because she is the only woman who has ever seen me as a complete person, rather than simply a beautiful object to be possessed. She has given me the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the freedom to be myself without pretense or performance." Tears streamed down Penelope's face as Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the assembled guests watched in stunned silence. "As for my appearance," Nathaniel continued, addressing the crowd while still holding Penelope, "I hid it for a decade because I was exhausted by being valued only for my face, by being reduced to nothing more than a pretty image. I wanted to be valued for my mind, my character, my actions, but I am done hiding. Let those who wish to stare do so. I care nothing for their opinions. The only opinion that matters to me is that of my wife, and she has assured me that she loves me for reasons that have nothing to do with how I look." He released Penelope just long enough to face Isabella directly. He did not yell, he did not rage. Instead, he delivered the cut direct. He looked straight through her as if she were made of glass, as if she were not standing there at all, rendering her invisible and socially dead in the eyes of the ton. "Come, my love," he said to Penelope, offering his arm and turning his back on Isabella completely. Isabella stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Her sister Juliana tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently that they should leave. The two women fled the musicale, their retreat hastened by the cold stares and whispered condemnations of guests who now saw them for what they were. In the days that followed, the tide of public opinion turned decisively against the Aldridge family. Lord Fairfax published a detailed analysis of the forged letter in the Times, conclusively proving it was false. Other experts came forward to confirm his findings. The servants who had been paid to spread rumors of Nathaniel visiting Isabella's townhouse were identified and dismissed from service, their testimonies revealed as purchased lies. The scandal that Isabella had hoped to create around Nathaniel and Penelope instead engulfed her own family. Lord Aldridge found himself shunned by his club, his business dealings suffering as associates distanced themselves from the taint of dishonor. Isabella and Juliana were cut from guest lists across London, their reputations in tatters. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's decision to reveal his face had an unexpected consequence. Rather than being objectified once more, he found himself admired for his courage in standing against those who had sought to destroy him. The fact that he was extraordinarily handsome became almost secondary to the story of his defense of his wife and his triumph over malicious enemies. Invitations flooded Winchester House once more, but this time they were addressed to both the Duke and Duchess, and they came from people who genuinely wished to know them, rather than simply to gawk at the beast or gossip about scandal. Penelope and Nathaniel attended a few select events, enough to demonstrate that they were united and unbowed. But they found they preferred their own company to that of society. And as the season drew to a close, they made plans to retire to Winchester Abbey, the ancestral estate in Devon that Nathaniel had not visited in years. The journey to Devon was long, taking several days over winding roads. But for Penelope and Nathaniel, it was a time of peace. They spent the hours in the carriage talking, planning their future, and simply enjoying the presence of the other, away from the prying eyes of London. The night before their arrival, as they stayed at a quiet country inn, Penelope felt a flutter in her belly that she had been noticing for several weeks. She had not mentioned it to Nathaniel, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes. But now, with the doctor's confirmation fresh in her mind, she could contain the news no longer. "Nathaniel," she said softly as they lay in bed, the firelight casting warm shadows on the walls. "I have something to tell you." He turned to face her, propping himself up on one elbow. "What is it, my love?" "I am with child," Penelope said, watching joy spread across his face like sunrise. "The doctor confirmed it before we left London. We are to have a baby in February." Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears as he gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of precious glass. "A child," he whispered. "Our child. Penelope, you have made me happier than I ever dreamed possible." "I hope it is a boy," Penelope said, running her fingers through his hair. "A son who has your intelligence and your kindness." "I hope it is a girl," Nathaniel countered, kissing her forehead. "A daughter with your strength and your compassion. But whatever we are blessed with, I promise you this: our child will be valued for who they are, not for what they look like. They will be free to be themselves, to develop their own interests and passions without the weight of expectations. We will teach them that beauty is only valuable when paired with good character," Penelope agreed, "that the worth of a person lies in their actions, their kindness, their integrity." They held each other in the darkness, imagining the future that stretched before them, a future filled with love and children, and the simple joy of being truly seen and valued by another person. Winchester Abbey proved to be everything Penelope had hoped for, and more. The estate sprawled across rolling hills that sloped down to dramatic cliffs overlooking the sea. The house itself was a magnificent example of Tudor architecture, with later additions that blended seamlessly with the original structure. Gardens bloomed in riotous profusion, and forests teemed with deer and other wildlife. Nathaniel seemed to transform in the country air, shedding the last of his guarded reserve. He showed Penelope every corner of the estate, with the enthusiasm of a boy sharing his favorite treasures. They rode across the moors, walked along the cliff tops, and spent long afternoons in the library, reading to each other. As Penelope's pregnancy progressed, Nathaniel became increasingly protective and attentive. He insisted she rest frequently, brought her favorite foods, and read aloud to the growing child, believing that the baby could hear his voice and should know its father before birth. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, Nathaniel rested his hand on Penelope's swollen belly. Suddenly he froze, his eyes widening in wonder. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I did," Penelope smiled, covering his hand with hers. "Your son or daughter is greeting you." Nathaniel kept his hand there, feeling the strong rhythmic kicks of the life they had created. For a man who had spent so much of his life feeling disconnected, treated as an object to be looked at, this physical connection to a new life was profound. "I am here," he whispered to the child. "I am here, and I will always love you for exactly who you are." Their son, William Nathaniel, was born on a snowy February morning in 1817. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Nathaniel feared he might lose Penelope, but she proved as strong in childbirth as she had in everything else, and when the baby's first cries rang through the birthing chamber, Nathaniel wept with relief and joy. William was a healthy, beautiful baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. Nathaniel held him with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the tiny, perfect life he and Penelope had created together. "He is beautiful," Penelope said softly, watching father and son with an expression of pure love. "He is perfect," Nathaniel agreed. "But more importantly, he is ours to raise with love and wisdom. He will never doubt his worth. He will never be reduced to his appearance. He will be free to be exactly who he is meant to be." The years that followed brought more children. Edmund, born 2 years after William, with Penelope's blonde hair and Nathaniel's serious demeanor. Catherine, born 3 years later, a merry child who looked like a perfect blend of both parents. And finally, when Penelope was 29 and Nathaniel 40, little Charlotte, named for Penelope's beloved grandmother. They divided their time between Winchester Abbey and Winchester House in London, but their hearts belonged to the countryside, to the freedom and peace they found away from society's scrutiny. As for the black hat that had once defined the Duke's existence, it met a definitive end. On their first night at Winchester Abbey, Nathaniel had taken it to the great fireplace in the hall. Together, he and Penelope had watched as the flames consumed the felt and silk, reducing the symbol of his hiding to ash and smoke that drifted up the chimney and vanished into the night sky. He never wore a concealing hat again, comfortable at last in his own skin, valued for who he was rather than what he looked like. On a warm afternoon in May of 1825, 5 years after the confrontation at Lady Talbot's musicale, Penelope stood in the gardens of Winchester Abbey watching her children play. William, now 8, was reading to Edmund and Catherine under the spreading branches of an ancient oak. A little Charlotte, not quite 2, toddled among the flowers with her nursemaid in close attendance. Penelope's hand rested on her swelling belly. Another child was on the way, due in the autumn, and she felt blessed beyond measure. Nathaniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked. "I was thinking," Penelope said, leaning back against him, "about the day I married the Beast of Winchester. I was terrified, certain I was being sacrificed to a monster who would make my life miserable. And instead," Nathaniel prompted, though he knew the answer, "instead, I found a man whose greatest curse was the very thing most people would consider a blessing. You were trapped by your beauty, imprisoned by other people's desire to possess something lovely, but I was able to see past that, to see the brilliant, kind, wounded man beneath. And in doing so, I found the greatest love of my life." Nathaniel turned her in his arms, kissing her with the passion and tenderness that had never diminished in their 9 years of marriage. "You freed me," he said against her lips. "You taught me that I could be valued for myself, that I did not have to hide to protect my heart. You gave me everything, Penelope. Love, family, purpose, joy. You are my salvation." "And you are mine," Penelope replied. "You saved me from a life of obligation and duty without love. You showed me what marriage can be when two people truly see each other, when they value character over appearance, when they choose each other every day." They stood together in the garden, watching their children play, secure in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful and lasting. The Beast of Winchester had been revealed as a man of extraordinary beauty, yes, but more importantly, as a man of extraordinary worth. And Penelope had proven that true sight has nothing to do with physical appearance, and everything to do with the courage to look past surface to soul. As the sun set over Winchester Abbey, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had entered into marriage expecting to be broken by a monster, and instead had discovered that the greatest monsters are often the prejudices and superficiality of society itself. She had found a man imprisoned by beauty and helped him escape, and in doing so had freed herself as well. Their children would grow up knowing that their worth lay not in how they looked, but in who they were, what they believed, how they treated others. They would be free from the curse that had plagued their father, the curse of being valued only for something as arbitrary and fleeting as physical beauty. And they would know, because their parents would tell them again and again, that the most beautiful thing in the world is to be truly seen, truly known, and truly loved for exactly who you are. The Beast of Winchester had revealed himself to be no beast at all, but a man who needed only to be loved without conditions, valued without selfishness, seen without judgment. And Penelope, the daughter sold to settle debts, had become the woman who taught him that such love was possible. Together they had proven that the greatest fairy tales are not about princes who save princesses from towers, but about two people who save each other from the prisons of their own pain and fear, and in doing so, create a love that transforms everything it touches. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and